All right, welcome. I'm here with Dr. Aidan Forth in the history program at MacEwan, and we're talking about his current research. So you've had a book come out to great acclaim. What are you working on now?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Dr. Romney. So right now, I'm working on a book called Camps, Mass Confinement in the Modern World. And this is a book, it's under contract with the University of Toronto Press. I have to get it done by 2022. I have a deadline that's quickly looming. So I'm working hard on that. But this is a book that in many ways broadens out some of the things I've already worked on. So my first book was called Barbed Wire Imperialism, Britain's Empire of Camps. And that was ultimately about how colonial officials in the British Empire turned to the camp, what they called the concentration camp, what today we might call an internment camp, refugee camp, in order to concentrate groups of undesirable colonial populations in order to control them in moments of emergency for one reason or another. And the pinnacle of this was the Anglo-Boer or South African War, which gave rise to the term concentration camp. The first time the term concentration camp was used was in South Africa, in British South Africa. So in many ways, I'm interested in concentration camps, but I come at it from a rather unusual perspective because I'm a historian of the British Empire. And normally when we think of concentration camps, we think of the Nazis or we think of the Soviet Gulag. We have in mind this kind of stereotypical image of suffering and death and extermination. One of my big arguments is that concentration camps, they're never a benign institution, but that the image that we have of them is perhaps too simplistic because regimes, whether they're liberal democracies or authoritarian dictatorships, have used many different types of camps over the course of the 20th century. The 20th century in particular was very much a century of camps. There were all kinds of different camps. And so what my current book does is it opens the topic out. It has 8 chapters in it, but only 2 of those chapters are about either the Nazis or the Soviets under Stalin. And so this book really kind of broadens the topic out. An early chapter looks at things like workhouses and prisons in the 19th century, which emerged as these technologies of managing undesirable populations, confinement, concentrating populations behind walls, behind fences, becomes very much a technique for population control and population management. Chapters 2 and 3 look at a variety of institutions, mainly in the colonial world, as well as in the American West, things like native reservations. I look at the sort of ethnic cleansing of North America through the various Indian removal acts of the 19th century. And then I look at colonial wars, very much flashpoints for the concentration of undesirable groups. We see, as I already mentioned, the South African or Anglo-Boer War. The Germans do something similar in Southwest Africa. The Americans setting up what they call concentration camps in the Philippines. The Spanish develop an institution they call the Rey Concentrado in Cuba during a colonial war there. So I provide kind of a longue durée history of camps starting all the way back in the 19th century. And then I have a couple chapters on the Gulag, the Soviet Gulag, although I make some interesting provocative comparisons between the Gulag, which is essentially sort of a system of forced labor and sort of penal management. I make some comparisons between it and the prison industrial complex in the United States today, which actually incarcerates more people per capita than the Gulag did in the days of Stalin. In my chapter on the Nazis, I very much consider, are there connections between what the Nazis are doing and what previous German colonial regimes did in Africa, for example? And then I have several chapters which I haven't yet written. So this is my goal this coming summer is to get a good start on them, where I look at a whole variety of other camps, both during World War II, things like the internment of Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans. I'd like to look at the Chinese labor camps, the Laogai, as they were known. I have a research trip to Washington, D.C. planned there as soon as the borders open. There's a major center for the study of the Laogai, the Chinese labor camps. I'd like to have a chapter that at least addresses the current Uyghur concentration camps in Western China. And I'll bring this all the way up to the present. We'll look at, Guantanamo Bay and the war on terror, extrajudicial detention. We'll look at what recently went on the US-Mexican border, the detention of migrants. We'll look at a whole variety of refugee camps, which on the one hand are intended as sort of institutes of humanitarian management, but which sometimes are quite punitive institutions as well, that put inmates to forced labor. There is, I think, a very unsettling similarity between today's refugee camps and some of the more menacing institutions of the 20th century. So the final chapter will look at that.
It's very wide-ranging.
It is, and it's kind of been, it's been an interesting endeavor, because my first book was an academic monograph, which is very much about a sort of deep dive of the archives and becoming an expert on one particular topic, knowing more about it than anyone else in the world.
Yeah.
This, however, is a book where I'm not apart from the kind of British colonial camps, I'm not really a leading expert on any of this. I have had to kind of learn a little bit about a lot of subjects. So rather than going for depth, I'm very much going for breadth, which has been a very different way to perform research than what I did before.
Right. Yeah. An interesting way of approaching the question too, is you're right. In grad school, we're trained to go for depth.
Yeah.
And to privilege it. So in looking at the breadth over over a century's worth of material, and you're going around the globe, many different countries, governments, styles of government. What would you say is like one of the kind of constant themes or threads that you've started to see in your research as you're looking at camps around the world?
Yeah, I think that there is something about the way modern states in particular manage populations. And so it definitely makes a difference whether you live in a liberal democracy or a totalitarian dictatorship. And I'm not denying that difference. But at a just more basic fundamental level, modern states are interested in managing their populations, in molding their behavior. There's a theorist, a sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman, who has compared modern statecraft with two things: with medicine. Medicine involves curing certain populations, healing certain parts of the body, but medicine can also include amputations. It can include surgically excising cells that you don't want in the human body. And the other metaphor that he uses is gardening. Gardening can involve cultivation of certain plants, but then it can include the fencing off, even the eradication of what are deemed weeds. And so this, I think, is something that happens in multiple different polities throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries. On the one hand, modern states are interested in including certain populations, but the act of inclusion is in and of itself also an act of exclusion, because it involves getting rid of populations that you don't deem desirable. This can sometimes operate according to racial discourses, which I think we see in, certainly in a place like Nazi Germany, but even in the United States in the 19th century with the ethnic cleansing of the Cherokee, for example, from the southeast into, further west when, they're exiled west, but then they're sort of confined within reservations and so on. It can operate according to discourses of class, which is something you definitely see, for example, the actions against the kulaks in the Soviet Union, so something like that. But camps always involve removing a group of people deemed undesirable. And so that's a theme that I think connects all of the cases I'm looking at.
Right. Yeah, the gardening metaphor with that is quite useful. And when you think about
no, and I mean gardens can be very beautiful, but they often involve killing a lot of things, or at least fencing them off. So
yeah, for sure. Excellent. So you've got a deadline for this. So I imagine that because you're working on it so much, that it's coming into your courses. So how are your students benefiting from this current research?
Well, that's right. I'm not sure how my students are benefiting, but I'm certainly benefiting from my students. So I've taught a couple times now a class called, this was actually at a previous institution, but I want to do it at MacEwan too. It would be a History 300 topics, which I call mass confinement concentration camps in the modern world. And so it was actually out of teaching this class that I first got the idea to write a more kind of general volume on the concentration camp. And the series that I'm publishing with, I should note, is very much aimed at the undergraduate classroom. It's with the University of Toronto Press's higher education division. So the idea is that this is something that's going to be widely read throughout institutions in Canada and hopefully, the broader English-speaking world. So the class I taught on concentration camps first kind of sparked the idea for this volume. And then I've used my classes since then to test out ideas, to assign books that I want to read, and I very much benefit from my students' insights into these. Next fall, I'm teaching a History 490 class called Prisons and Penal Colonies, which is going to really help me polish up my chapter on the Gulag, but also look at some of the institutions involved in chapters 1 and chapter 8 of the book. I have also assigned some of my draft chapters in classes. I assigned one of the chapters I've written in History 100, which is an introduction to the discipline of history. But I wanted students to kind of see what I'm writing on and speak to me as a historian, ask me questions of why do I argue that, and what source base am I using, and how did I determine to use that source rather than another source. I recently taught a History 442 called Settler Colonialism, which was crucial to me in writing some of the material on native reservations and policy towards indigenous peoples and so on. And I also assigned a chapter of my work in that class. And that was great to have fourth year students sort of critically assess my contribution there. So, I always see that teaching works best when it can draw from research, and research is at its strongest when ideas are actively being tried out with groups of young and intelligent students at MacEwan.
And it's a great way to, involve them in the academic process and let them play around and see how history works, how we do what we do.
That's right. I also, quite recently I had to peer review a manuscript, and it's a blind review, so I'm not allowed to say what the book's for. But I incorporated a couple students I'm working with in an independent study to do that too, to kind of introduce students not only to the content, but to the process of academic scholarship. So I feel that, whether or not they're interested in concentration camps, they'll develop kind of a critical understanding of how knowledge is produced and how it's assessed.
Yeah, that's great. How the conversation goes. Yeah, excellent. Wow. Well, I think think that is a good note to end it on. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I appreciate any opportunity to discuss my work.